All right, so, you sent over this book, and it's got a pretty attention-grabbing title, The Creature from Jekyll Island,
Yeah.
a second look at the Federal Reserve. And, well, let's be honest, that title alone kind of hints at a critical take on, some pretty fundamental stuff when it comes to our financial system.
Absolutely. It definitely sets the tone for a deep dive into, well, the heart of the American financial system.
Yeah, exactly. And, I've got to say, having skimmed through the excerpts you sent, the core of Griffin's argument here, it's pretty provocative. He's suggesting that the Federal Reserve wasn't something that emerged from public need, but rather it came out of this, well, kind of a secretive gathering of influential bankers
Right.
who were, potentially looking out for their own interests, maybe not so much the public good. And he suggests this had some pretty significant and potentially negative effects on the American economy.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. And I think, what's interesting is that he presents it as this almost like a conspiracy,
Right.
like this secret meeting on Jekyll Island, where these powerful figures come together and basically engineer this system that benefits them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a compelling narrative for sure. And that's what we're here to do today, right? Unpack this, understand the main arguments that Griffin lays out, the historical narrative, his perspective on what he considers, a pretty pivotal moment in American financial history.
Exactly.
And just to be super clear for our listeners, everything we're discussing today comes directly from the excerpts you provided. We're staying within the boundaries of this source material, really trying to get a handle on Griffin's claims and the story he's telling in this book.
Absolutely. That's a really important point to emphasize.
So where does the story begin, according to Griffin?
Well, it all revolves around this supposed secret meeting, right? This clandestine gathering that took place in November 1910 at the Jekyll Island Club
Jekyll Island.
off the coast of Georgia.
Sounds like something out of, like, a mystery novel.
Yeah, exactly. It's shrouded in secrecy. And that's a big part of Griffin's narrative.
So who are the key players at this secret meeting?
Well, you have some major figures from the financial world at that time.
Yeah.
You've got Nelson Aldrich, who was a senator,
Right.
but also had very close ties to Wall Street. You have Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York.
Huge institution.
Absolutely. Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Benjamin Strong, who later became the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Wow.
And then you have Paul Warburg, a partner in Kuhn, Loeb & Co. So these are major, major players in the financial world.
Okay, so these aren't just like, some friends getting together for a weekend getaway.
No, absolutely not.
This is a serious meeting of serious people. And you mentioned secrecy. The book really emphasizes that, right?
Absolutely. And that's a crucial point because, according to Griffin, they were very deliberate about keeping this meeting under wraps. Attendees supposedly only used their first names, so there wouldn't be any record of, who was there.
Yeah.
And, they were very careful about, who knew about this meeting. And the reason for that, according to Griffin, is because the purpose of this gathering was to draft legislation for a new central banking system for the United States, which at the time was a very controversial idea.
Sure.
And so they knew that if word got out that these powerful bankers were meeting in secret to, design this new system, it would generate a lot of public opposition.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds kind of suspicious, right?
Absolutely.
Like, what are they hiding?
Right. And that's exactly the kind of narrative that Griffin is putting forward.
Okay, so they have this secret meeting. They come up with a plan. What did this initial plan, this so-called Aldrich plan, look like?
Well, the Aldrich plan, as described in the book, was really the foundation for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. It proposed a central banking authority with a substantial degree of private control.
Okay.
And this is where Griffin really starts to raise concerns, because he sees this private control as a fundamental flaw in the system. It also envisioned a system of regional associations that would issue currency backed by commercial paper and all under the oversight of this central board. And the idea was to create a more elastic currency, one that could expand and contract with the needs of the economy.
Okay, and that makes sense on the surface, right. But given that it was Aldrich's plan and his ties to Wall Street, I'm guessing it wasn't exactly met with open arms by everyone.
You're absolutely right. The book talks about how the Aldrich plan faced significant political opposition, and a lot of that had to do with Aldrich himself.
Right.
He was seen as representing the interests of Wall Street.
Okay.
And there's a lot of suspicion about, whether this plan was really in the best interest of the country or whether it was just a way for these big bankers to consolidate their power.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did they overcome that opposition? Because obviously the Federal Reserve did eventually come into being.
Right. And this is where this story gets really interesting. Because according to Griffin, the core ideas of the Aldrich Plan didn't just disappear. They were repackaged, rebranded, and ultimately implemented as the Federal Reserve Act.
Clever.
Yeah, it's almost like a political magic trick.
Right.
They took the same basic concepts, but dressed them up in a way that was more palatable to the public and to politicians who were wary of anything that seemed too closely tied to Wall Street.
So same blueprint, different marketing,
Exactly.
and figures like Woodrow Wilson, they played a role in this.
According to the book, yes. Wilson was initially skeptical of the Aldrich Plan,
Okay.
but once he became president, he ended up supporting the Federal Reserve Act.
Mm.
And Griffin suggests that this was partly because the act was presented as a way to provide greater stability to the financial system and prevent panics, which was something that Wilson was very concerned about.
Okay, so let's talk about the end result, the Federal Reserve Act. How did it actually structure the Federal Reserve System?
Well, it established a system of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks,
Okay.
which were overseen by a central Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Now, one of the key points that Griffin emphasizes is that these regional banks were privately owned by member commercial banks.
Hmm. Interesting.
But the Federal Reserve Board was a public entity.
Okay.
So you had this kind of this hybrid structure.
Right.
And Griffin argues that this structure gave private banking interests a significant amount of influence over the system.
Okay, and what about the money itself, the Federal Reserve note?
Right.
Where does that come from?
So the Federal Reserve Note, according to the book, became the standard currency of the United States. It obtained legal tender status, meaning that it had to be accepted for all debts, public and private.
Right.
But Griffin highlights the fact that these notes were obligations of the Federal Reserve banks themselves,
Mm.
not of the U.S. government.
Okay, so that's a distinction.
Right, and that's important because it gets to one of Griffin's central criticisms of the system, which is that it allows the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air.
Out of thin air, that's a bold statement. How does he explain that?
Well, he goes into the mechanics of fractional reserve banking
Okay.
and the Federal Reserve's ability to purchase government securities in the open market.
Okay.
So when the Fed buys government bonds from banks, it credits the bank's reserve accounts.
Right.
And those reserves can then be leveraged under the fractional reserve system to create multiples of new money in the form of loans.
Hmm.
So for every dollar that a bank holds in reserves, they can potentially lend out a much larger amount,
Right.
creating new credit in the system.
Okay.
And Griffin argues that this process of money creation is inherently inflationary
Inflationary. Okay.
because it leads to an expansion of the money supply that's not necessarily backed by a corresponding increase in goods and services.
Right. And so that's where you get that classic definition of inflation, right? Too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly.
Okay. And the Fed has tools to manage this whole process, right?
They do. They have the discount rate, which is the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow money directly from the Federal Reserve banks.
Hey.
And then they have open market operations, which is the buying and selling of government securities.
Right. Right.
And Griffin argues that these tools give the Fed a tremendous amount of power to manipulate the money supply and influence interest rates.
Okay. So we've got this central bank, private influence, power to create money, influence the economy. What are some of the main concerns that Griffin raises about all of this?
Well, as we've touched on, inflation is a major concern.
Right.
He argues that the Federal Reserve System is inherently inflationary because of this ability to create money out of nothing.
Right.
And he believes that this leads to a debasement of the currency, a decrease in purchasing power.
Okay.
He also argues that the system facilitates the growth of the national debt because the Fed, by purchasing government securities, is essentially providing a ready market for government borrowing,
Right.
which makes it easier for the government to spend beyond its means.
And Griffin sees that as a problem.
Absolutely. He believes that this leads to a transfer of wealth from the public to private banking interests who hold these securities.
Okay, so he's not just concerned about the economic effects, but also about who benefits from the system.
Exactly. He sees it as a system that's rigged in favor of the financial elite.
Interesting. Now, the book also seems skeptical about the Fed's ability to actually stabilize the economy and prevent financial crises.
Yeah, and that's another major point of contention. Griffin argues that the Fed's track record is not very good.
Mm.
He points to historical events like the Great Depression
Right.
to suggest that the Fed's actions either caused or exacerbated these crises.
Okay.
And he believes that this is because manipulating the money supply and interest rates creates artificial signals in the market,
Okay.
which leads to malinvestment and eventually corrections.
So he sees intervention as potentially making things worse, not better.
In many cases, yes.
Interesting. And then there's this whole issue of control, right? The idea that there isn't genuine government control over the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. And this goes back to that hybrid structure we talked about,
Right.
with the private ownership of the regional banks and the influence of private banking interests.
Okay.
Griffin argues that this lack of transparency and accountability is a major problem. And he believes that it allows the Fed to operate in ways that are not in the best interests of the public.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to go back to that title for a second. The creature from Jekyll Island.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that metaphor?
Well, I think it really captures Griffin's central thesis. He's portraying the Federal Reserve as something that was created in secrecy, away from public scrutiny, like a creature being cooked up in a lab.
Right, right.
And the Jekyll Island part obviously refers back to that secret meeting where the initial framework was drafted.
Right.
And the creature itself, I think, symbolizes something that has grown and evolved in ways that are potentially dangerous and harmful to the American economy and to its citizens.
So it's this idea that this thing has taken on a life of its own.
Exactly.
And it's not necessarily serving the purposes that it was intended to serve.
Right, and that it may even be operating against the interests of the people it's supposed to be serving.
That's a powerful image. So let's kind of recap our deep dive here. We've explored this alleged secret meeting at Jekyll Island, where this small group of influential bankers supposedly came up with the blueprint for America's central bank.
Right.
We've talked about the transformation of the Aldrich Plan into the Federal Reserve Act.
Right, the rebranding.
The rebranding, exactly. We've looked at the key features of the Federal Reserve, as Griffin describes them, the structure, the Federal Reserve note, the mechanisms of money creation, and we've outlined some of the major concerns that he raises: inflation, the national debt, economic instability, and this lack of genuine government control. And we finished with this really striking metaphor of the creature, highlighting Griffin's critical perspective on the Federal Reserve's origins and its impact.
I think that's a very accurate summary.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting is how he connects this historical narrative to the present day.
Right.
Because he's essentially arguing that the same forces that were at play back in 1910 are still at play today.
That's a thought-provoking idea.
And it really challenges us to think critically about the role of the Federal Reserve in our lives and in the economy as a whole.
Absolutely. You know, it's easy to take these institutions for granted.
Yeah.
But when you dig into their history, when you understand the context in which they were created and the potential motivations behind them, it really does make you think twice.
It certainly does.
So considering all of the arguments that we've explored today, I'm curious, does this change how you view the Federal Reserve's actions and its influence on your own financial life?
It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Griffin wants us to do, right? To question, to be informed, to not just accept things at face value.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've tried to do today.
Yes, and I think it's important to remember that this is just one perspective.
Right, right.
There are many other perspectives on the Federal Reserve and its role in the economy.
Absolutely. We always encourage our listeners to do their own research, to read different viewpoints, to come to their own conclusions.
Exactly.
But I think, Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, it definitely offers a provocative and thought-provoking starting point for that journey.
It certainly does.
So for all of you listening out there, dive in, explore these ideas, and let us know what you think.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Yeah, this was a great conversation.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.